Shane, and he's going to walk us through the U.S. rail market.
All right, yeah, so I'll dive into the U.S. rail market a little bit more. And as Ken said, please stop me if you have any questions at any points. So we'll go over some of the main characteristics of the U.S. rail industry. So who owns the tracks? The majority of the tracks are owned by private operators, mainly the Class 1s, which are the large freight operators in the U.S. And a lot of the tracks are shared among different operators between Class 1s and some of the smaller railroads as well. They all kind of share the railroads and intertwine. Amtrak as well, which is the main public transportation, uses majority of freight tracks to transport its passengers. On the private versus public side, the private rail market is much larger than the public. I know in Europe, the public transportation and trains are a really big industry. In the US, that's not the case, at least yet. There's some push to expand the public transportation and trains interstate. But as of now, the private side is much larger. Private organizations own and operate much more than the government owns. On the freight versus passenger side, as I said, the freight industry is much larger than the passenger, and we'll dive into that a little bit more down the line here. And as Ken mentioned earlier, a lot of the tracks and operations are throughout all of North America, so spanning in north into Canada and south into Mexico as well. Two of the Class 1 railroads, which are the largest operators in the freight industry, are actually Canadian organizations and enterprises and have operations throughout the US. And then the standard track gauge throughout the US is 1.435 meters, and that's standard for all freight and public transportation. So some of the economic indicators for the US rail industry, specifically freights. The trucking industry is still much larger than the rail industry in terms of moving freight. So it's about 792 billion compared to the rail industry, which is about 80 billion. However, the rail industry is still extremely vital for the movement of freight across the country. It supports about 167,000 jobs and supports many different industries that rely on the trains to actually move the materials they need to produce their own supplies. And some of those are heavy manufacturing, agriculture, auto, and other smaller commodities. And then the ocean and coastal transportation industry is smaller than the rail, but they also intertwine, as well as the trucking industry. A lot of these organizations kind of switch the freight from the ocean, from the ships onto the trains, which then move into the intermodal facilities, and then that freight is transferred onto a truck to get sent to its final destination. So the freight industry as a whole are really intertwined and all kind of work together to get the goods where they need to be moved. So as I said, the freight industry is much larger than public transportation. Amtrak is the main passenger rail service in the US. In 2021, they had a revenue of $2.08 billion. There are 7 Class 1 freight operators in the US, and in 2021, their combined revenue was about 71 billion. So it's a fairly substantial difference in the size of the markets. And so when we're talking about passenger rail, we're talking about Amtrak, which is the large interstate organization, as well as smaller city metro systems. And there's a few other small passenger rail services throughout the country that are more region focused. And passenger systems are owned by the government and funded by the government, and use public procurement to get supplies. On the freight and cargo side, these are all privately owned companies which are self-funded, and they all have their own procurement processes in place, some of which are similar to the public procurement on the government side, some of which differ a little bit. But overall, the freight and cargo side is much larger and a much bigger opportunity for SMEs to sell to, especially considering some of the trade barriers for the public procurement on the government side, such as the Buy America regulations, which we'll get into a little bit later as well.
It should be noticed that there are some private passenger trails, but usually it's only for a few miles. It's more for tourism, but it's not really for the movement of individuals. So the United States very heavily relies on the automobile to move passengers from one city, from one part. Even the bus system is there, but it's not the major movement of people. Major movement of people is in the automotive industry.
So we'll get into some of the key actors and organizations in the rail industry, specifically on the freight side. So we'll have a slide on each of these, so you can move ahead. So the Federal Railroad Administration, or the FRA, is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, but their main focus is on the railways, both freight and passenger, but they really focus on the safety regulations of the rail industry, and also focus on some selective investment and dispersing funds to different projects throughout the country to expand the rail industry. Next slide. The next one here is the Surface Transportation Board. So this is actually an independent federal agency, but they're charged with the economic regulation of different types of surface transportation, primarily being freight rail. So they kind of exercise their authority to resolve disputes, as well as make different rules for some of the larger freight rail operators. The STB is a big part of the interchange rules, and kind of negotiate a lot of the sharing of the rails that are owned by different private organizations. And then we'll move on to Amtrak. As I mentioned earlier, Amtrak is the main passenger railroad service in the US. From interstate, a lot of big cities have their own metro systems, but Amtrak is really the one that, if you want to move from state to state on a train, you'll be on Amtrak. They operate in the US as well as 9 cities in Canada. And it's a quasi-public organization, but it's completely owned by the US government. And they have public procurement as their own standards. So overall, they operate over 34,000 kilometers of track, but Amtrak only owns about 1,000 kilometers of that, the rest of which is owned by Class 1 freight railroads.
Should be noted that Amtrak has a very active service between East Coast, between Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. And the rest of the country, it's more of almost like a tourism. Some of these trains only run once a day, maybe twice a day. So if you're used to a regular schedule like passenger trains in Europe, you're only going to find that on the East Coast, what they call the Northeast corridor, between Boston New York, and Washington, D.C.
Mhm. So the next organization here is the Association of American Railroads, or the AAR. The AAR really advocates for the freight industry, primarily the large organizations, which are the Class 1 railroads and Amtrak. So those are the full members of AAR are those 7 Class 1 railroads and Amtrak. And then they also have many smaller associates and affiliates, which are the smaller US freight railroads, which are the Class 2s and 3s, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the AAR, as I mentioned, they advocate on behalf of those freight railroads and lobby for their interests to the US government. And they also have a department that focuses on safety and operations that sets some different standards, which have been incorporated into the official standards and regulations in the US government. They also sell a different range of publications, including best practices for different parts of the industry, such as rail safety, standards impacting rolling stock, freight loading, control systems, and a lot of different areas as well. So this is really a key organization for the US freight industry specifically. The next one here is the American Railway Engineering and Maintenance of Way Association, or I'll just refer to it as AREMA. That's a little bit easier. So they're a professional association for railway engineering and personnel. And they offer a lot of different educational opportunities to a lot of smaller suppliers to the rail industry. They also publish best practices for railway engineering. And there's about 5,500 members that use AREMA to learn and figure out how to get into the engineering side of the rail industry. So this is really a key association for some of the suppliers to the industry, specifically on the engineering and some of the infrastructure of the rail systems. Then the last organization here is the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, or the ASLRRA. So they represent the owners and operators of short line and regional railroads, also called Class 2 and Class 3 railroads. So these are the smaller freight railroads. Some of them are still pretty large comparatively, but they're much smaller than the Class 1s. So they represent the interests of these smaller railroads that are pretty essential to the industry as a whole, but don't really have a voice themselves. So they come together into this organization and they lobby on behalf of all these smaller regional railroads. They lobby on behalf of them to the US government and represent their interests that way. So at this point, are there any questions about some of these different organizations?
Yes, I have a question, Shane.
Mhm.
The question is, how far, which is the big distance between an European SME and those associations? Because it's nice to see that they exist on the US territory, but here from Europe, how a small and medium enterprise can reach them, be member, what they can learn, how they can promote what they have. Not in the public procurement, that is another question. For the time being, association in the US and SME in Europe, how to join them. Do you have ideas, suggestions, or something like that? Thank you.
Sorry, Ken, are you?
Yeah, go ahead, Shane.
I would just say all of them are individual organizations and have different ways to join. I'm not sure specifically on if European organizations can become full members. I'm sure at least they can become affiliates and associated with them. I think some of the best ones for European SMEs would probably be this one here, the Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, ARIMA, which is the Engineering and Maintenance of Way Association, is a really good one for some of the suppliers. The
This one,
AAR,
right?
yeah, that would be the second best, I would say. The AAR is the one that advocates on behalf of some of the large Class 1 railroads. That would probably be tough to become a member of or an affiliate, but definitely good to get to know. And I'm sure they would be able to, get some of the European SMEs the right contacts. But I mean, I can do some more research on that and include how to become a member of these organizations in the handbook, which we will be delivering shortly after these training sessions.
Did that answer your question, Guido?
Yes, I think that this has to be more detailed in some of the documents in order to give some elements to the SMEs, because I think it's important not to forget to have this in mind. They are existing. They are big players in the US, and without playing with big players, we reduce for the SMEs some of the market access, not through the association, but also because we believe in association, we believe in clusters. So we know how much they are important for lobbying and other things. So if this is valid in Europe, is also valid in the US. And yes, if you can more detail this and to give some elements how to join, what is which are the rules, which are the limits, and whatever could be helpful for SMEs. From an SME point of view, it can be useful. Thank you.
No, we can definitely add that. Matter of fact, Shane, why don't we take a look at that, and then maybe tomorrow we can address this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here, while we didn't, these are the national associations, but it should also be noted that there are state organizations as well. So almost every state has their own associations for railroad operators, members of the industry. And many of these state organizations are important as well. And so the challenge always is for a supplier, yes, be a member of the national organization, but what state organizations should be part of this as well. And because there's quite a bit of activities, especially in some of these states like Texas, California, Ohio, where there's a lot of rail operations as well. We tend to take a much more strategic, or I should say targeted, we call it a rifle approach, where depending on which country, which SME we're talking about and what their product is and what the product or service is, then we hone in specifically which organization that they should would be most useful for them.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'll continue. As I mentioned, there's 3 different classes of freight railroad operators in the U.S.
Oops, sorry, Shane.
No
Go.
So the class 1 is the largest operators in the U.S. There are 7 class 1 freight railroads. They have a combined revenue in 2021 of about $71 billion. The class 2s are the next largest. There is about 22 class 2 operators in the US, and their combined revenue in 2021 was $5.5 billion. And then lastly are the smaller regional or local railroads, which are the class 3s. There are about 584 class 3 operators in the US, and their combined revenue in 2021 was roughly $3.3 billion. And the way these classes are distinguished is based on their revenues. So class 1 operators are any operator that earned greater than 900 million US in the previous year. Class 2s are any revenue in between 40.4 million and the 900 million, which is the threshold for class 1. And then class 3s are any operator with less than 40.4 million. And it is possible for these railroads to switch classes based on if they had an up year or down year. However, that hardly happens with the class 1s. Those have been pretty steady for a good amount of years now. But some of the class 2s and class 3s do switch around a little bit based on their revenues. And overall, the class 1s are the large part of the industry. They account for about 68% of the total freight rail mileage, 88% of all the employees in the industry, and about 94% of the total revenue. They operate on approximately 150,000 kilometers of track throughout the country, including some in Canada and Mexico, and operate across 46 different states. The class 2s and 3s combined operate for about over 72,000 kilometers of track, and they operate in 49 states. So the class 2s and 3s kind of fill the gaps where the class 1s miss. And we'll kind of see that a little bit more on some of the next slides with the maps. So are there any questions about the different classes of operators at this time? All right, then we'll go through and start looking at some of these the class 1s more in depth. So the first one here is BNSF Railway. As you see, they're a very large company. They're headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas, down in the south of the US. Thank you, Ken. They employ about 34,000 people, serving over 40 ports with 26 intermodal facilities where they switch between rail and truck, or rail and ocean freight. So their revenue in 2021 was about 23.2 billion US dollars, and they invested almost 3 billion back into capital investments in 2021 as well. Some of the infrastructure of BNSF have over 13,000 bridges, 89 tunnels, 25,000 plus grade crossings, and operate over about 52,000 kilometers of track throughout the US. And BNSF or BNFS is, I believe, the largest of the class 1 operators. As far as procurement, they have a private procurement process, which includes applying to become a supplier through their website in an online form, and then waiting to be contacted by one of their purchasing officers. And they then will inform the approved suppliers of any possible bidding opportunities that may come up. And they do use a competitive bidding process to procure supplies from any suppliers, so regardless of location. So the next one here is Canadian National Railway. As I mentioned, 2 of the class 1s are actually Canadian companies. So this is one of them. Together in Canada and US, Canadian National employs about 24,000 people and had a revenue in 2020 of about 11 billion US dollars. They're headquartered in Montreal, Canada, but they do have a lot of track throughout the US as well, even down to the Gulf of Mexico. And they operate about 32,000 kilometers of track. And to become a supplier, they also have an online supplier portal with all the information on how to do business with them. And they also use a competitive bidding process, which I think we'll see is pretty much the norm for some of these larger railways that have a lot of potential suppliers that are trying to sell to them. They use a competitive bidding process. The other Canadian Class 1 is Canadian Pacific. They're headquartered in Calgary, Canada. And they employ about 11,000, and their revenue was in 2020 about 6.1 billion US dollars. They operate over 20,000 kilometers of track, mainly in Canada and in the northern US. So to become a supplier for Canadian Pacific, they partner with SAP Ariba to support their end-to-end supply chain process, which is an online portal. They purchase a variety of goods from suppliers across the globe, as they put it. So they obviously don't face any Buy America regulations in their procurement process and can buy from pretty much anywhere in the world. That being said, they do use a competitive process, and for some European companies, it may be harder to compete with more local companies that have better lead times and cheaper freight costs. But they do purchase a variety of goods, including corporate services, fuels, IT, roadway materials, rolling stock, and many other supplies. The next one here is CSX Transportation. They're headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida, down in the southeast, and employ about 20,000 people as well. Their revenue in 2020 was about 10.5 billion US dollars, and they have about 34,000 kilometers of track. As you can see, they're focused a lot on the east coast of the US. From all the way up to Canada and down to the south there. So they also use a competitive bidding process to procure goods. The process includes needing to be in compliance with the CSX code, where they essentially audit the suppliers themselves. The next step would be to be approved by CSX. Once you are approved by CSX's procurement team, then it'll be constant communication between the two. And then finally would be procurement, and they would reach out with any bidding opportunities for suppliers to bid on. The next Class 1 here is Kansas City Southern Railway, headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri. So their revenue in 2020 was about 2.63 billion US dollars. So slightly smaller than some of the other Class 1s, but still a fairly sizable company. They operate over 5,500 kilometers of track. And they also use e-sourcing or online sourcing to procure materials. As you can see, Kansas City's tracks do go south into Mexico, all the way down past Mexico City. So that was kind of some of the overlap we were talking about the tracks kind of being split throughout all of North America and not just confined to the US. Kansas City Southern also mentions that they frequently enter into contracts with the US government for funding. In this case, the procurement would be subject to some Buy America regulations and other trade barriers for foreign companies. This isn't the case with the majority of freight rail or Class 1s. But on some of these specific projects that receive funding, from the government is where some of those restrictions do apply, and it can be pretty tough for foreign companies to win the bids there. The next class one here is Norfolk Southern. They're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, also on the eastern portion of the US. They employ about 34,000 people, and their revenue in 2021 was about $11 billion. They operate over 31,000 kilometers of track throughout the country, again, mainly on the eastern region, both north and south. But they're a major transporter of a lot of industrial products, including agriculture, forest, as well as consumer products. So really all types of freight are moved through Norfolk Southern, as well as some of the other large class ones. To become a supplier for Norfolk Southern, there's an online form, as well as some tax information that has to be filled out to be approved as a supplier for Norfolk Southern. And they, like some of the other class ones, they also use a competitive bidding process for procurement in the end. And the last class one to round it out is Union Pacific. Union Pacific is the second largest. They're headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska, in the center of the country. They employ about 31,000 people, and their revenue in 2020 was about almost 20 billion US. They have a lot of track throughout the country, especially on the East Coast, where some of the other class, or on the West Coast, excuse me, where some of the other class ones do not operate. They have over 51,000 kilometers of track. And they kind of fill the gap on the East Coast there. And as you can see, so this is the track of just the class ones on this map here. You might see a lot of gaps in between. And that's where some of the class 2 and class 3 railroads kind of fill those gaps to make the full grid for the US. So that's where some of the smaller railroads kind of fill in and complete the freight industry as a whole. And to become a supplier for Union Pacific, it's also a competitive bidding process to actually win any of the projects. They have a code of conduct and a different online supplier form to fill out to start that process as well. And they do purchase a large variety of goods for all different parts of the railway. So before we move on to the class 2s and 3s, I guess, are there any questions on the class 1s, some of the large operators in the industry?
Yes, I have a question. I would like to know, have you tried those portals of the 7 class 1 railroads? Which is the easiest for an SME, a European SME, to become a supplier or approved? Or if you have tried, can you classify them or just give us some feelings that you had in this exercise? Thank you.
So sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Yeah. Typically, these portals are very specific to that particular class 1. And you really go through the steps. We have gone through the steps with other major companies and a couple of these. And there is it's a gate. So you have to go fill out the application, and hopefully you get a response or some type of interaction. Is there a general overview which one of these 7 is easier than others? I would say no. So what you're going to find, and especially when we get into the tenders, is that there are regulations at the federal level, you got regulations at the state level, you have regulations of each individual rail operator. So while could be some generalization of it, to say, oh, it's easier to be a qualified supplier for Union Pacific versus Norfolk Southern. Unfortunately, the answer is it depends. What we do find is that we're going to start talking about class 2 and class 3 railroad operators. They tend to be much more less stringent than the class 1s. And so there's an opportunity with these smaller rail operators as opposed to the larger ones.
Thank you.
So yeah, moving on to the class 2s, there are 22 class 2 railroads in the US. These are mainly regional railroads that operate over a state or a couple states, much smaller than the class 1s, but still a very sizable industry and good opportunities for European SMEs to sell to. So as I mentioned, they all of these companies here have revenues over 40.4 million annually. So they're all sizable companies as well, and definitely procure goods in their own ways as well. As we'll see a little bit later, some of these companies are actually owned by what we call railroad holding companies, which usually own multiple of these railroads and some of the class 3s as well. So we'll get into those a little bit later. And lastly are the class 3 railroads. As we said, there's over 580 class 3 operators throughout the US. Some of them are very small. Some of them are fairly large, up to 40 million in revenue. Together, they operate over 69,000 kilometers of track throughout the US, kind of filling those gaps that the larger railroads miss. And the class 3s are really crucial to the industry as a whole. They kind of keep everything together, working with the class 1s and 2s to transfer freight between the two, as well as operating a lot of the intermodal facilities, transferring either from ports or from trucking intermodal facilities to rail, then transporting to a different rail company. For example, a Union Pacific so one of the class 1s may use a class 3 to transfer some of its goods to a different track, which will then be carried by a separate class 1 to its final destination. So a lot of these companies really do work together, intertwined, and the class 3s kind of hold everything together there. So they are very essential to the industry as a whole. And as I mentioned, some of these railroad holding companies. So all of these companies own and operate multiple regional and short line railroads. Some of them that I want to highlight here are Genesee and Wyoming. And Genesee and Wyoming also do have a presence in the UK and Europe. So I was interested to hear if anyone has heard of Genesee and Wyoming, if their presence is large in Europe or not.
I think Jenny was the one that was from the UK. I don't see her on though.
Okay, we'll keep going. But yeah, I was just kind of interested in that because they do have a large presence in the US, owning and operating over 116 of the smaller railroads. So together they serve over 43 states and 4 provinces in Canada. As I mentioned, some of their operations in Europe, they have one of the UK's largest maritime intermodal facility operations and are also the second largest freight rail provider in the UK, as well as some other operations throughout continental Europe. But their subsidiaries and joint ventures provide rail service for more than 30 major US ports and some of that intermodal transloading and rail car switching facilities as well. And they have their own procurement process for all of their subsidiaries and railroads that they own. And that's also through their website. They have a supplier sign up portal to go through those steps. And they procure a lot of different goods, including engineering materials, vehicles, rolling stock, logistics equipment, fuel, you name it, they're buying. So
Sorry, Shane. Thank you. I'm also from the UK.
Oh,
I have heard of the name of this company, but I don't think our the university has worked with them.
okay, got it. Yeah, I was just interested because I thought that was weird that they had a presence in the UK specifically, but are very spread out throughout the US. And
Yeah,
so,
thank you.
some of these other railroad holding companies I wanted to highlight are Watco. They're another large one. They operate over 5,500 miles, so 10,000 some kilometers. They also have operations in Australia. And they do mention that they give preference to suppliers with quality certifications like M1003 or ISO 9001. And they have their own procurement process as well. And for more information, some of these smaller SMEs can email them at supplierinquiries@watco.com. And some of that information is also in the main report that we sent earlier. The last one of these that I want to highlight is RJ Corman. They're another one of the larger holding companies. They own about 20 of the short line rails in the US, primarily in the southeastern region. So some of that Florida, Georgia area. And they work with all Class 1 operators. As I mentioned, a lot of the different railroad operators work together. So they do a lot of the transloading and intermodal service for some of the larger Class 1 operators. They post their open bidding opportunities on their website. I checked this morning and the only current open bids they have were for asphalt paving in Tennessee and Pennsylvania. So probably not specifically of interest to any of these European SMEs, but some opportunities may come up on their website there. And then just wanted to cover some industry events, some of the large ones that have happened this year and that are upcoming. So the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association that we mentioned earlier had their annual conference in May in St. Louis, Missouri. The North American Rail Shippers annual meeting was in Kansas City, Missouri in May. The Railway System Suppliers, Inc. CNS exhibition is actually going on right now in Kansas City, Missouri. So as you can see, a lot of these are center of the country where everything kind of comes together. And then some of the upcoming ones are the Midwest Association of Rail Shippers. As Ken mentioned, there's a lot of states that have their own associations. Some regions also have their own associations. So this is the Midwest, and their 2022 summer meeting is in July 18th and 19th in Lake Geneva, which is actually pretty close to both Ken and I. And lastly, the Railway Supply Institute Expo and Technical Conference will be in Fort Worth, Texas in October.
Do you have
Hey.
the same for 2023?
I can put together a list of some of the upcoming events for 2023 if that would be of interest.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, we'll make sure to include that, either go over it tomorrow or in the handbook that we'll be delivering.
No, but all the answers or to my question, not for tomorrow, for the next days, because you have already, you are doing a good job, but even if I raise question, it's not that I need the question tomorrow. Again, from a SME point of view, which one are of those events, those that you can recommend, and why, from your point of view? Because you can understand that an SME cannot participate to 5 events in 2022 or
Right.
the equivalent in 2023. Which one? Where we can find buyers, where we can meet buyers? Why one of those events is very, very important for European SMEs? This could be, from your point of view. We have our own idea, but your point of view could be also useful. Thank you very much.
My first instinct would be the ASLRRA, the Short Line and Regional Railroad Association Conference. Just because this is where a lot of the smaller railroad operators will meet, as well as a lot of the railroad holding companies will meet. I think both Ken and I agree that the class ones would be pretty tough to sell to for a European SME, at least to start off with. And some of the smaller class twos and class threes, as well as the railroad holding companies that own and operate multiple class two and class threes, would be the best opportunities initially. And you'd find all of them at the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, the annual conference.